Serious, nurses and doctors of Reddit, what's your weirdest, scariest paranormal stories that took place during work? Episode 3. I am a nurse, but this did not happen to me, but several other nurses who worked at these units. There is a little girl who haunts the burn unit of a large military medical treatment facility in the US. She has been seen by both staff and patients. Haunts may not be the correct term, but she has been witnessed by several. Second, I used to work at the old Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In the old one that moved back in 2011, there was a VIP ward, I believe it was Ward 72. Any retired general officers would stay there, along with any higher-ups in the government, think Secretary of State and other cabinet officials. There was also a room for the First Lady and President. This ward is private, locked at all entrances, and very nice. It is furnished with very high-end furniture, and a lot of it was donated by Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, per my friend who worked there, the ghost of Mamie Eisenhower is very particular about anyone staying in her room, and if anyone did sleep in that room, she would yank off the bedsheets. My friends also said decorative pieces would randomly fall off the table or fly off the walls when they were the only ones up there. Mamie would also apparently page the supervisor, who would call the ward back to a very confused nurse as to who paged them. I floated up there 2 to 3 times during my time there. My friend was on with me and told me all of this. I didn't believe her, so I went and sat in the room where Mamie would mess with people. I fell asleep, but sadly nothing happened that night. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elected mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and, in fact, seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. It was declared AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whoever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again." Marion paced all day, every day. Not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. We've actually had a room sprinkled with holy water several times by our pastoral care due to the number of deaths we've had in the same room. I worked as a med tech at an assisted living facility. One day a resident, I'll call her Margaret, suddenly passed away, and her family left all her belongings in the room that night, including her pendant, to call the staff for help. The next night Margaret's neighbor called the staff because someone was talking in the room next door and keeping them awake. We brushed the resident off, knowing that Margaret's room was empty. About an hour later, Margaret's pendant started going off from her empty apartment. I was the only one willing to go turn it off, so I walked into the room, and it was freezing cold in the middle of summer. The air conditioning was off. Suddenly the bathroom door slammed as I was turning off the pendant light. I locked the door and ran back to the nurse's station. We forced one of the older male staff members to go check out the entire room, and he claims the door was still locked when he got down there, and no one was in there. One of the rooms we have is obviously having something of a haunting. A man in a gown gestured one of the techs to come in, she went in, and he was gone. 1 week earlier, a female patient was asking to get a different room, because a man wouldn't leave her room. We just thought it was some sort of delirium. Multiple others have seen him too. One day a patient had to go to the X-ray, which he was taken to in a wheelchair. About 5 minutes later, the notification from the patient's room went off, and me and my favorite work buddy went to the room. As we stepped in, we saw that the room was empty, and the windows were closed. Even the bed was missing in which the patient did not go to the X-ray. We both told a fully examined nurse, and even she had no idea where the bed went. In the end, we had to fill the room with another bed. I'm still a nursing student, but this was the most paranormal thing I have witnessed so far. I'm an ICU nurse. A patient's son rang the hospital at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, saying he was sure his dad was dying. His dad had had a severe stroke and was doing okay, recovery would be difficult, but he wasn't expected to die and was pretty stable at the time. I was looking after him, and he was a lot of work because he would try to get up but couldn't walk, so he'd fallen a lot. The son really wanted to come in, even though it's way past visiting hours, but you know I'll bend the rules in a good cause. I figured, what the heck? It's his Saturday night, come on in and sit with your dad. The patient died about 2 minutes before the son walked in the door. It was like a switch was turned off, he just died. The last thing he said to me was, "Am I bothering anyone?" I told him, of course not, even though he had some very frustrating behavior because of the stroke. The son just started crying and screaming, I knew it. How the heck he knew? We were all a bit freaked out. I'm a labor and nursery nurse, mostly it's call lights alarming from rooms that are completely empty. Sometimes it would coincide with approximately the time of death on another unit or be the anniversary of a fetal demise. However, my creepiest. We have a button to push after a delivery to play a lullaby over the PA system announcing a birth through the hospital. One night no one was even in the same room as the button, and the lullaby started playing. It did that twice, then we unplugged the entire thing. It still went off once more that night, and again a few days later despite being entirely disconnected. That was a few years ago, and no one ever heard it do that before or since. The final time we heard the lullaby, it was about 3 a.m., and they had recently called a code blue on another floor. My coworker just stood up and said, "Okay, whatever you are, you're creeping us out. Go to the light." The time of death was called a few minutes later, and it's never happened again. It was approximately 3 years ago. It's an old building with all kinds of electrical and plumbing issues, so I'm sure there's a logical explanation, but the timing was eerie enough to make us have the heebie-jeebies. It's a small rural hospital, so sometimes we'd go the entire night without a single patient on the floor, but call bells would still alarm. The call lights that would ring were empty rooms, or from completely vacant floors. The worst part is that you have to enter the room to turn off the alarm. Never got any miscellaneous calls from rooms that had patients in them. The same thing still happens after a complete rewiring and update of a new call system. I am a nurse in a hospital, and my patient was a well-known card reader in town, not too unheard of in Louisiana. I had actually gone to her about 10 years prior, and she was eerily accurate. While caring for her for a few days, I walk into her room, and she is unresponsive. She had been very lethargic all day, but now she was out. Her daughter is at the bedside and is trying to wake her up. I sternal rub her and inflict pain with no response and a very thready pulse. I call a rapid response. This woman then woke up randomly and was full of energy within a 30-second span. She told me she was dead and watching me in the room the whole time. Knew exactly what happened. She said God told her it wasn't her time and sent her back. She went home a couple days later, and she is still doing card readings. She's in her late 80s, She didn't really say too much afterward. When I told her that she had been very sleepy all day, she told me that she was actually slowly dying and knew the exact moment she left her body. Her daughter in the room told me that even though it looked pretty bad when I first got in the room, she felt very calm. Almost like her mother was comforting her. My patient knew I had called for help but woke up before the help even got there, and before I had a chance to tell her, I called for it. She would also apparently do readings on the fly for staff members who entered her room. Always spot on too. They were freaked out, lol. This was an odd experience. I'm a nurse in the PACU and was on call during a big ass snowstorm. I didn't want to drive home and risk getting called back in, so I stayed at the hospital that night on our little couch in our break room. I dozed in and out throughout the night, but I got caught in some state between wakefulness and sleep, and I fucking swear to God I felt this malevolent being in the room with me at one point. It was super dark, and I just felt anger from it, like this unbridled hatred and rage. It was so heavy it was palpable. It almost felt like it was jealous I was alive. Anyway, it came down on top of me and pretty much collapsed through me, and I just heard it cry in seething anger. Then, it was gone, and I was fully awake. I've had sleep paralysis from time to time, but this felt different. And I have never felt such hatred from anything I've come across in my life, real or conjured. The cliche part here is this happened around 3 a.m. I've had a kind of similar experience from when I lived in Honduras for a time. Late at night, I heard the weights on the upstairs terrace rolling around like and hitting crap but no wind. I slept like crap for a while. Then I had a horrible dream where I felt something dark and evil in my dream, and I tried everything I could to not look at it in my dream. Then I woke up and felt this dark and malevolent being in my room and felt it come over and sit, not super accurate, on me and try to crush me. Then it got off and went to the corner of the room. During all this, my roommate was tossing and turning in the top bunk. I'm religious, and so I sat up and invoked the name of Jesus Christ, and I felt the evil recede back to the open-air pathway between apartments, but it didn't fully leave, and I just still felt this feeling of hatred. In the morning, it was gone, and I asked my roommate if he had experienced anything. He heard all the sounds and felt the presence too. Outside of this time, there were tons of times where the country went nuts around 3 a.m., dogs just in the street all staring in the same direction at something and just absolutely losing their crap. Or we would just feel something in the streets, and the dogs would bark like crazy as something seemed to go down the street. Telling you, these third world countries and places with lots of unrest have absolutely crazy stuff happen during the witching hour. Also, for the record, our apartment area was super weirdly set up, so I hope my descriptions made sense. We were on a night shift, standing or sitting around the nurse's station and talking about weird things that had happened. One of the HCAs was in a side room once, doing last offices, and the lights flicked on and off twice, calls and bells going off when there was no one about to press them, hearing a cough when there was no one there, etc., etc. As we were talking, there was a pause in the conversation, and very clearly, we heard typing from the keyboard at the doctor's desk, which was just around the corner from us. I stepped around the corner to see who it was. As usual, the doctors would check in with us before sitting down, just to say hello and to see if there were any jobs needing down. So, I looked around the corner after hearing the keys being tapped as if someone was typing, only to see no one there. It was very freaky, and we had to change the convo as we all felt too uncomfortable after that. I've had a few experiences here and there before. Mostly stuff I would chalk down to being just a dream, or just the spooks, nothing really legit, although interesting. This was different, though, because it was a shared experience. My family and my best friend were staying at this hotel in Puerto Rico that was owned and managed by my aunt. It was the top floor of a townhome suite and absolutely gorgeous with geckos and an enclosed tropical garden surrounding us. But even in the midst of all the tropical wonder, I couldn't settle down. Whenever I was in the hotel, I felt uncomfortable and watched. Luckily it was small, 3 rooms, so I was never alone, but even with that, there was a sense that someone was present. I also kept seeing something like a mist or a wisp in the corners of my eye. Okay. So what? Ignore it, right? People see stuff out of the corner of their eyes a lot, and that's super common, but I wanted to mention it to my best friend. I specifically chose not to. Something in me felt it wasn't typical, and I had an instinctual sense that told me, don't speak about it until you're out. It was a visceral gut feeling, and a sense that speaking of it would make the oppressive feeling would make things worse and precipitate more phenomena. So that's what I did. I decided not to spook anyone during the stay and kept my trap shut. Only when we checked out did I realize everyone had the same realization. My best friend confirmed it. She kept seeing things too and having dreams that someone was walking around the hotel at night. My brother was having auditory hallucinations. Someone had called his name sharply while he was in the bathroom, and things were being knocked off the shelf whenever he was in there or taking a shower. Even things that were previously stable, and this poor guy has a history of paranormal phenomena. Our mom too. And man, oh man, our mom had the worst. Apparently, she felt stalked, like someone was walking behind her touching her hair, but she said she just knew not to speak power to it. Guess what? Apparently, the townhouse had a really bad history. We were on the top floor, but on the bottom floor, a guy died. I heard the story from my aunt, who used to rent to him. He stayed there during the summers with his 2 kids. Of course, he was a divorcee with a drinking problem. Sad, she said, but otherwise, a decent person. One morning, though, the kids woke up to find him dead. His skull was cracked open, and he was covered in ants. He had kept his alcohol on the top shelf out of his kids' reach, and, presumably, fell and broke his skull on the kitchen bar. That's that. Bad history. The kids' trauma. The fact that everyone in my family and my best friend experienced mild to very specific phenomena. And all of us decided to keep our mouths shut so as to not scare anyone really gets me thinking sometimes. When I was a nursing student up on an ICU floor, I was hanging antibiotics in my patient's room when I heard an audible hey. I turn around, and there is no one else in the room. Mind you, my patient was intubated and sedated, so there's no possible way it was them. It was a woman's voice as well, so I thought it was my preceptor. I went back out to the nurse's station, and I asked my preceptor if that was her in the room, trying to catch my attention. She told me no, and I've never seen someone's eyes get so big. Apparently, the room I was in has had the most paranormal sightings and activity out of all the rooms on the unit. Sightings as in shadows sitting in the corner of the room, voices being heard, and curtains being flung violently across the railings. No one ever told me about this room prior to my preceptorship, so it just added to everyone's beliefs it was haunted as fuck. This story is more about my mom. She's a nurse. She was walking through her nursing home and acting like it was a normal day. But it wasn't. People were looking at her really weirdly. After a couple hours, someone asked her what had happened to her child. She asked what they were talking about. They said that everyone had been seeing a bloody boy walking beside her all day. Then she looked behind her, and no one was there. Then all day after that, people kept asking what happened to her child. When she got home, she looked up every incident at her nursing home. She found something about a murder, but I don't remember the whole story. We had a little boy come by ambulance and was a toddler. His parents had put him to bed, and he was with a cold. Nothing serious but developed tragically into more, and he started coming in and out of consciousness. We had to do a rapid intubation, and he ended up passing away a few days later. Before Mom and Dad made it to the hospital, he kept talking about his baby sister Hannah. Not soon after, we had to life-saving measures. I was distraught because I had a son similar in age and a daughter named Hannah. Fast forward. Approximately 2 years later, the family comes in with a sick infant. They remembered me, I did once I recalled their story, and I was their provider again. Their daughter's name was Hannah. It startled me, and I recalled with clarity the boy speaking of his sister, whom I assumed was alive and at home. Nope, she wasn't even conceived yet. Baby, thankfully, went home with parents and doing well, but I'll never forget that. Little boy and his baby sister, Hannah. Sorry, I know you asked for nurses and doctors, but I couldn't help telling this one. Growing up, my maternal grandmother and I were always pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, but my mother was not. She thought her mom was a crock, and she was sure I was making stuff up. Just as a preface. So, while Mom was in nursing school, she worked as a home health aide. She got a pretty cushy gig working with this disabled woman named Mary. I was too young to know what was wrong with Mary, but looking back now, I would guess she was someone who was mentally 5 though she was in her 50s. Mary's parents had provided well for her, left her with her own giant, beautiful home fully equipped for a handicapped person, enough money and a fund to finance care, etc. So, Mom was one of only 4 staff to work with Mary, because she did not like new people, 2 midnighters and 2-day staff. She received around-the-clock care, but Mom was able to bring Mary home with her, so we spent a lot of time with Mary as a family. Mary was sweet and very kind. I actually have an old photo of me, her and Mom when I was dressed for one of my dance parades. We all loved her to death. One morning, on a day, Mom was off work but had school. She got up in a rush and ran downstairs. I thought she was late for school, so I went down with her to help her get what she needed to leave. But she was on the phone, dialing people who were not answering her. I will never ever forget this. Mom was shaking and crying, blubbering to herself without making any real sense. She finally slammed the phone down on the table and put her hands on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had woke up to Mary at her bedside patting her hand the way she did when she was very pleased with something Mom did, but when she sat up in bed Mary was gone. The phone rang, and it was the nurse at the house. Mary had passed away the night before. She came to tell Mom goodbye. She still never believed in the paranormal, but she did quit nursing school and never worked in home health again. She never said, but I got the sense she couldn't handle another Mary happening to her again. My mom was pretty stoic, but that broke her.